Will Jones, a 49-year-old Hell's Angel with more lives than a junkyard cat, lay pinned beneath the twisted metal of his Harley, blood seeping into the Pennsylvania soil as darkness began to fall. The motorcycle lay mangled against an ancient oak, its chrome finish reflecting the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy. Will's leather-clad body had been thrown 20 feet from the impact site. His prized Harley-Davidson, a machine he'd lovingly rebuilt with his own calloused hands, now nothing more than twisted metal and spilled fuel. The veteran biker's weathered face contorted in pain as he assessed the damage. A deeply gashed leg, at least 2 broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder that hung at an unnatural angle. His cell phone, shattered beyond repair, mocked him from a puddle of muddy water. The irony wasn't lost on him. 30 years riding with one of America's most notorious motorcycle clubs, surviving bar fights, rival gangs, and countless high-speed chases, only to meet his potential end on a solo ride through the Pennsylvanian wilderness. With the day's light fading fast, Will fought through waves of pain to drag himself toward the wreckage. Each movement sent lightning bolts of agony through his battered frame, but decades of hardship had taught him that pain was merely weakness leaving the body. His tattooed hands, adorned with faded ink proclaiming "Live Free" across scarred knuckles, trembled as he rummaged through the saddlebags that had miraculously remained intact. The inventory was grim. Half a bottle of whiskey, a switchblade, a now-soaked pack of cigarettes, a Zippo lighter that might still work, and a small first aid kit he'd kept more for show than practical use. No food, no water purification tablets, no emergency flare, nothing that spoke of preparation for 7 days alone in these unforgiving woods. Night fell with predatory swiftness, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seeped through Will's leather jacket. The forest transformed around him, once familiar sounds morphing into an alien symphony that set his nerves on edge. He had ridden through these woods countless times, finding peace in the solitude they offered, a respite from the chaos of club life. Now, that same wilderness regarded him not as a visitor, but as prey, vulnerable, injured, and alone. With hands trembling from both pain and the onset of shock, Will set about creating shelter. His decades of living rough came into play as he dragged himself and whatever useful debris he could find beneath a rock outcropping, creating a makeshift lean-to against the incoming rain he could smell on the shifting wind. The first night was a battle against his own body's desire to shut down. Every motorcycle accident victim knew the danger of concussion, of falling asleep and never waking up again. Will fought to stay conscious, using the burn of whiskey on his wounds and the sharp sting as he reset his own shoulder as anchors to the waking world. He bit down on a strip of leather cut from his jacket as he manipulated the dislocated joint back into place with a sickening pop that echoed through the trees. Stars exploded behind his eyelids, and for a moment, unconsciousness threatened to claim him, but the old biker had endured worse pain during his decades with the club. Physical suffering was an old friend, one that had shaped him into the man who now faced the darkness alone. By dawn, fever had set in. The gash on his leg, hastily cleaned with whiskey and bound with strips torn from his t-shirt, throbbed with alarming heat. Will knew the signs of infection well enough. He'd seen brothers die from less during his years on the road. The cool morning light revealed the full scope of his predicament. He was at least 15 miles from the nearest highway, in a densely wooded area rarely visited by hikers, especially in the off-season. The skid marks from his motorcycle would be the only immediate sign of his departure from the forest road. But with rain threatening, even those might be washed away before anyone thought to look for him. Club protocol dictated that brothers didn't raise alarms unless someone was missing for at least 3 days, a policy born from too many false alarms after weekend benders. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Will made his decision. He would not die here, not like this. Survival meant movement, finding water, food, and better shelter. With a grunt of determination, he used a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch and took his first agonizing step deeper into the forest toward the sound of running water. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had spent his life defying authority and embracing chaos was now at the complete mercy of nature's own chaotic indifference. But unlike the human adversaries he'd faced down with bravado and violence, this opponent couldn't be intimidated by his reputation or the death's head patch sewn onto his battered vest. In these woods he was no longer a feared Hell's Angel, just a man, broken and bleeding, fighting for one more day of life. The creek water tasted like salvation as it coursed down Will's parched throat. He had spent the entire morning dragging his injured body through underbrush and over fallen logs, following the faint sound of running water until he collapsed at the creek's edge. His hands trembled as he fashioned a crude cup from a large leaf, drinking slowly to avoid shocking his system. The mirror-like surface of a calm pool revealed a stranger, face caked with dried blood and dirt, beard matted, eyes hollow with pain, and the beginning of something he rarely allowed himself to feel: fear. This wasn't the controlled danger of a high-speed chase or a tense standoff with rival clubs. This was primal, existential vulnerability, and it shook him to his core. For the first time in decades, William Wild Will Jones, respected and feared enforcer of the Hells Angels, felt utterly powerless. By the third day, hunger had become a constant companion, a gnawing presence that clouded his thoughts and weakened his already compromised body. The switchblade that had once been used to intimidate rivals now served as his primary survival tool, as Will set crude snares using strips of leather from his jacket and techniques half remembered from a military survival course he'd taken before being dishonorably discharged decades ago. His first success, a rabbit caught in the early morning hours, brought tears to his eyes. With hands that had beaten men unconscious in countless bar fights, he now carefully, almost reverently, skinned and prepared the small animal, using his dwindling supply of whiskey to sterilize both the meat and his increasingly infected leg wound. The fire he struggled to build with his Zippo and damp kindling was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, its warmth and light, a defiant stand against the wilderness that sought to claim him. The infection worsened despite his efforts. Red streaks began to crawl upward from the gash on his thigh, and the fever made nights a hallucinatory hell where past and present blurred. In his delirium, Will saw the faces of men he'd hurt, women he'd abandoned, and opportunities for a different life he'd rejected in favor of the brotherhood that now seemed so distant. Between fever dreams, a moment of clarity struck him, with the force of a physical blow. No one might be looking for him yet. His solitary nature, once a point of pride within the club, now meant that his brothers wouldn't miss him for days. The prospect of dying alone in these woods, his body becoming food for the very forest that had claimed him, triggered something primal in the hardened biker. With shaking hands, he used the last drops of whiskey to sterilize his switchblade before doing what he knew was necessary: cutting open the infected wound to drain it. The pain of self-surgery nearly caused him to pass out. But Will channeled decades of enduring physical punishment into a meditative state, separating his consciousness from the white-hot agony radiating through his leg. Blood and pus drained onto the forest floor as he worked, removing dead tissue with the precision of a man who understood that hesitation meant death. When he finished, he packed the cleaned wound with a poultice made from plants he recognized from childhood summers spent with his Cherokee grandfather, knowledge he'd buried beneath layers of rebellion and urban survival, but which now emerged when his life depended on it. That night, as fever still raged through his system, Will dreamed not of violence or brotherhood, but of his grandfather's weathered hands, teaching him which plants healed and which harmed, a legacy he had ignored until now. By the fifth day, Will had established something resembling a routine. Mornings were spent checking traps and gathering what edible plants he could identify with certainty. His shelter had evolved from the initial desperate lean-to into a more stable structure, incorporating fallen branches and a waterproof layer of large leaves. The wound on his leg, while still angry and painful, no longer threatened imminent sepsis, and he could put weight on it for short periods. Each small victory, fire, food, improved shelter, became a source of pride unlike anything he'd felt in years. There was no audience to his achievements, no brothers to impress with daring or brutality. There was only the honest accomplishment of staying alive another day, of adapting and persevering against odds that would have broken many men. In the simplicity of survival, Will began to recognize a version of himself long buried under years of club politics and posturing. The sound of voices on the morning of the sixth day nearly stopped his heart. Weak from his ordeal, but moving with the caution of a man who had learned to be wary of strangers, Will crept toward the source of the human sounds. Through the underbrush he spotted two hikers, a young man and woman, clearly experienced outdoors people judging by their gear, moving along a trail he hadn't realized was less than half a mile from his camp.
Hey, wait.
His first instinct was to call out, to end his ordeal immediately, but something held him back. These weren't his people. They would see his tattoos, his cuts and bruises, and make judgments. They would see the outlaw, not the man who had spent 6 days reconnecting with a deeper, more essential part of himself. The woman pointed to something on her map, her voice carrying clearly,
ranger station nearby,
"We should reach
but
the
it's
ranger
isolated."
station by noon tomorrow
Ranger
if we
station?
keep this pace."
Isolated?
Tomorrow. A ranger station. A plan formed in Will's mind as he silently tracked the hikers for an hour, noting their direction and pace before returning to his camp. That night, as stars pierced the canopy above his shelter, Will made peace with parts of himself he'd been running from for decades. The silence of the forest, once threatening, now felt like a rare opportunity for reflection without judgment. He thought of Nick Davis, the prospect he'd been mentoring before this ill-fated solo ride, a young man with the same chip on his shoulder that Will had carried at 26. He thought of the violence he'd both endured and inflicted, the code he'd lived by that now seemed simultaneously vital and absurd when measured against the raw arithmetic of survival. The forest didn't care about his colors or his reputation. It responded only to respect, ingenuity, and perseverance. As he drifted toward sleep on what he decided would be his last night alone, Will Jones realized that the most dangerous predator in these woods wasn't the bears or mountain lions. It was the man he had been before the crash, moving through life with a carelessness born of believing he had nothing left to lose. Dawn broke with unexpected clarity on the 7th day. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving Will exhausted, but more lucid than he'd been since the
This is
accident.
workable.
He broke camp methodically, leaving no trace of his presence except for a carefully extinguished fire pit. Every item that could still serve a purpose was packed into a crude bag fashioned from what remained of his leather jacket. The switchblade, now dulled from days of use as everything from a hunting tool to a surgical instrument, was cleaned and secured in his boot. Will tested his injured leg, still painful, but functional enough for what lay ahead. According to his calculations based on the hiker's conversation, the ranger station should be roughly 5 miles northwest of his position. 5 miles of rough terrain with a badly injured leg and depleted strength. 5 miles separating him from return to civilization and the life that waited there. With one last look at the shelter that had kept him alive, Will began his final journey through the wilderness, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that survival wasn't about speed, but about persistence. The forest seemed different now. no longer an adversary, but a complex ecosystem that he had become part of during his 7-day ordeal. Will noticed details that would have escaped him before: the subtle signs of game trails, the varying textures of bark that indicated north-facing sides of trees, the specific calls of birds that signaled either safety or the presence of predators. He moved through the underbrush with a newfound respect, no longer crashing through like an entitled visitor, but gliding with a quiet acknowledgement that he was passing through someone else's home. The journey was punishing on his weakened body, each step a negotiation between determination and physical limitation. Twice he had to stop and rest, propping himself against ancient trees whose silent witness to his struggle seemed almost compassionate. A stark contrast to the indifferent eyes of humans he had grown accustomed to meeting with defensive aggression. By midday, Will caught his first glimpse of human construction through the trees, the weathered wood of the ranger station's observation tower. The sight should have filled him with unalloyed relief, but instead, complex emotions surged through him. Part of him, the part shaped by decades of tribal loyalty and distrust of authority, hesitated at the threshold between wilderness and civilization. The week alone had stripped him of pretenses, of the armor he'd constructed to navigate a world that had rarely shown him kindness. Now he would have to don that armor again to explain himself, to be judged not by his resilience, but by his appearance, his history, his affiliations. As he stood at the edge of the clearing, swaying slightly with exhaustion, Will realized he was returning to society a different man than the one who had crashed his motorcycle 7 days earlier. The ranger who spotted him emerging from the tree line was initially cautious, hand moving instinctively toward a radio at the sight of the battered, wild-looking man. Will couldn't blame her. He knew what he must look like.
I made a mistake.
What the tattoos visible through his torn clothing signified to most people.
Let me see.
But when he spoke, explaining his situation with a directness and humility that would have been foreign to him a week earlier, her professionalism took over. Within minutes, he was seated inside the station, a bottle of clean water in his trembling hands as she radioed for medical assistance. The questions came. Of course, how had he survived? Why had he been riding alone in a restricted area? Who should they contact? Will answered truthfully but selectively, focusing on the practical aspects of his survival rather than the internal transformation that had accompanied it. Some revelations weren't meant for incident reports or medical evaluations. News of his rescue spread quickly. By the time the medical evacuation helicopter arrived, the story of the Hells Angel who had survived a week alone in the Pennsylvania wilderness had already begun to circulate among the small community of rangers and emergency responders. Will could read it in their eyes as they loaded him onto the stretcher, a mixture of professional assessment, morbid curiosity, and the unconscious judgment he had anticipated. One young paramedic, securing his IV line, whispered with ill-concealed awe, "My brother rides," said the Angels are the toughest sons of bitches on the road. Guess he was right.
Good, you're doing great.
Will merely closed his eyes, too exhausted to explain that whatever strength had kept him alive in those woods had little to do with his patch and everything to do with something more fundamental, more universal than any club affiliation. The hospital brought its own form of wilderness, a landscape of beeping machines, antiseptic smells, and the peculiar vulnerability of being cared for by strangers. Will's injuries were treated with efficient compassion, the leg wound professionally debrided and stitched, the broken ribs bound, antibiotics coursing through his veins to combat the infection his crude methods had only partially contained. But it was the arrival of Nick Davis, the 26-year-old prospect who had been the first to raise the alarm when Will failed to return from what should have been a day ride that truly marked his return to the world he had left behind. The young man's face, normally set in the hard lines of someone determined to prove his toughness, crumpled with naked relief when he saw his mentor alive. "The others are on their way," Nick said, his voice thick with emotion he would never have shown in the clubhouse. They've been searching for 3 days since I made them listen to me about you missing check-ins. In the days that followed, as club members came and went from his hospital room, with the awkward gestures of men unaccustomed to expressing concern, Will began the process of integrating his wilderness experience with the life that awaited him. The story of his survival spread, growing more exaggerated with each telling. Tales of him fighting off bears, building elaborate shelters, performing Hollywood-worthy self-surgery. He neither confirmed nor denied these embellishments, understanding their function in club mythology. But when alone with Nick during a late-night hospital visit, the young prospect asked the question no one else had. What was it really like out there, Will? Not the bullshit everyone's talking about, but what it did to you inside.
in the stories you've heard.
In the quiet of the hospital room, with the sounds of the ward muffled by closed doors, Will Jones shared the genuine lessons of his 7 days alone, not tales of conquering nature through brute force, but of finding strength in adaptation, in humility, in recognizing one's place within something vaster and more enduring than any human construct of power or control. It was a different kind of toughness than the one he had spent decades cultivating. But as he spoke, he saw in Nick's attentive face the possibility that these lessons might take root beyond his own experience, might even, in some small way, influence the direction of a life still in formation.